Thank you, Mr. President. In the fall of 2014, an outbreak had the world on edge in West Africa. The Ebola virus had come about and 3 countries were being decimated. It was at this time that the director of National Institutes of Health gave an interview where he argued that a vaccine would likely be available if the Congress had not slowed funding for the agency. He added that the Ebola crisis had forced NIH to divert money from other critical research. These were striking charges, especially for an agency that has a budget of $30 billion. So it stands to reason that if underfunding NIH was allowing a crisis such as this, that we ought to be appropriating more money to the agencies. We can't ignore the fact, obviously, that the nation is $18 trillion in debt and running a nearly $500 billion deficit. So I began to look into NIH funding, some of the research projects that were being funded. And here are some of the questions that I found the researchers were trying to find answers to. One of the things they're trying to find answers to at the NIH, and this was part of a taxpayer-funded study or a grant, was why do some people see Jesus' face on toast? That's right, a taxpayer-funded study to determine why people see the face of Jesus on toast. Another study that was funded by NIH was, do drunk birds slur when they sing? That was part of a $5 million NIH grant that found not only is the answer yes, but according to NIH standards, there's a binge-drinking bird out there now. They also wanted to answer the question, what type of music do monkeys and chimpanzees prefer to listen to? Now, I'm not sure what's more surprising, the fact that NIH actually studied this, or that the answer is Metallica. Now, another thing they studied at NIH is yawning contagious? Now, I would submit that anybody who's seen a senator give a speech knows that the answer to that is yes. But NIH decided to spend taxpayer money studying it anyway. So I began investigating projects being funded by other research arms within the federal government, including this National Science Foundation and DARPA in the Defense Department. Now, here are some of the questions those agencies are using their multi-billion-dollar budgets to try to answer. Where does it hurt to be stung most by a bee? One researcher used part of a $1 million NSF fund or grant to sting each part of his body. He came to the conclusion that it's most painful on the nostrils or on the lips, or on other, shall we say, more sensitive areas. Though he admitted that his advisor would not allow him to be stung on the eyeball, so we really don't know which body part holds the title of being most painful. Another thing that was studied by NSF and DARPA is who will be America's next top model. That's right, taxpayer money was spent to try to find out who would be America's next top model. Researchers used taxpayer money to scour Twitter and Instagram to develop scientific models that could forecast success for models in the fashion industry. It turns out that having a strong social media presence helps more than meeting the industry's, quote, aesthetic standards. This is a phenomenon the researchers dubbed the Kendall Jenner effect. Not surprising there. Another thing that was studied are chimpanzees better gamers than humans? At least one chimpanzee, who was sometimes bribed with candy to keep working, was unfortunately better than humans at gaming. Unfortunately, that chimpanzee has since died from complications from diabetes. Now, that study, which found that humans are not above trying to cheat in order to beat a chimp at a video game, was funded as part of a $340,000 grant awarded by NSF and NIH. Now, I'm not going around here trying to say that NIH, NSF, DARPA, and other federally funded research is a waste of money. It is not. To the contrary, I believe federally funded research can do wonderful and amazing things. In 1961, at the height of the Cold War, the United States faced the Soviet Union in a heated space race. President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and aimed for the moon. He said, "I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving that goal before the decade is out." of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. No single space project in this period would be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, he said. Now, armed with a clearly defined goal and backed by concentrated research of the federal government, America's best scientists, researchers, and engineers got to work. 8 years later, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were walking on the moon. That's a towering feat that no country has ever been able to repeat. More than a half-century later, that moonshot stands in stark contrast to a massive and disorderly constellation of federally funded science projects floating aimlessly in the federal budget. Projects that ask, for example, are Republicans or Democrats more disgusted by eating worms? This researcher, who you'll see a picture of here, this researcher found that the answer is that Republicans are more disgusted. That said, once folks hear that this study was funded with taxpayer
The gentleman's time's expired.
May I ask for 2 additional minutes, unanimous consent?
Without objection.
When folks hear that this study was funded with taxpayer dollars, I'm sure there will be equal disgust among Republicans and Democrats. Another study that was funded was Can You Outrun a Dinosaur? NSF and NIH spent taxpayer dollars to giving them to enterprising researchers who are not deterred by the fact that dinosaurs are now extinct. They found that an alligator was close enough, and what else? They had to put him on a treadmill to find out how fast he could run. They found, as nobody, certainly not the presiding officer from Louisiana, would discover, that alligators don't like treadmills very much, and he wasn't very cooperative. But they went ahead with a study and found that humans could probably outrun a dinosaur. Good thing. Are cheerleaders more attractive when they are a part of a squad? Was another study that we funded. This was a taxpayer-funded grant, NSF, National Science Foundation, actually inspired by the sitcom How I Met Your Mother. They had something on that show called the cheerleader theory. Researchers found that the answer is yes, cheerleaders are more attractive as part of a squad than individually. Their tongue-in-cheek research paper postulates the, quote, having a few wingmen or wingwomen may indeed be good dating strategy, particularly if their facial features complement and average out one's unattractive idiosyncrasies. Now that brings us full circle, as the White House has just asked Congress to appropriate $1.9 billion in emergency off-budget spending to tackle the latest crisis, Zika. Now, I believe that we do need to find a solution and a vaccine for the Zika virus. But we ought to look hard at the other things that these agencies are spending money as we talk about more money for these research projects. To that end, I've released 20 questions, government studies that will leave you scratching your head. This is a study that's, you can see the cover of here. The report not only profiles many of the questionable projects I've highlighted here today, it seeks to set a path that will ensure that our money is spent wisely. The report recommends that these agencies set clearly defined national goals and objectives for federally funded research. And following the example set by President Kennedy's moonshot more than a half-century ago, we ought to give the agencies a clear mission. The report also recommends that we prioritize billions of dollars in existing federal research to best meet the national goals in a manner that strengthens America's scientific leadership. We also need to ensure that these research projects are transparent. So when funding goes to these research projects, we ought to know how much is spent on each individual project, not just the broader grant. We don't know exactly how much money was spent on the cheerleader effect because we can't. They won't tell us. So I'm introducing legislation today in concert with this report, which will require that the federal agencies actually tell us how much money is spent on these individual projects. It's time that Washington sets clear goals for federally funded research and we improve transparency measures. I hope that we can do so. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back.